Well, hello again, everyone. As you can see, I am back in 1860s Virginia, um, and some interesting things have happened. You remember that the Enterprise went through a wormhole, and unbeknownst to us, the Romulans also went through that wormhole, and now they are here somewhere. Um, Trying to get the Confederacy to win the Civil War and throw things into chaos. I don't know exactly what they have in mind, but I am here, of course, knowing what the history is. I am here at Wilmer McLean's house. That's behind me at a little place called Appomattox Courthouse, and this is where the war is going to end. Now, nobody on Earth here knows that at this point, but and the armies aren't here yet. It's rather just a nice tranquil day here at the McLean house. But I am here under orders from the Enterprise to watch out for Romulans and see if we can do that. But it gives me a lot of time to just sit and think. And I thought, well, what better time than now to talk a little bit about the Civil War. So excuse me while I get a drink, and then we will get moving here. All right. So when the war starts, you remember that we talked about kind of the non-battle stuff in the war, but now we're going to talk battles. And what I want to do first is kind of go over the grand strategy with you, and then we'll get into it. Because if you understand the larger strategy, I think then you will understand that when we get into the specific battles and that sort of thing. So the northern strategy is based on what's called the Anaconda Plan. And it had eventually, by this time in 1865, where I am, it had 6 parts. And I like to think of them as 6 different words: suffocate, liberate, cut, chop, decapitate, and grind. And so this is to suffocate the South by the blockade, and we've already kind of talked about that in last time I was here on Earth. And then liberate has to do with the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation we'll talk much more about after the Battle of Antietam in 1862. But it was not only a revolutionary social pronouncement, but it was also a military strategy to try and get rid of the working understructure of the South, so that they could not conduct the war anymore. And so that's kind of the liberate part of that. The cut part is to cut the Confederacy in 2 by taking the Mississippi River, taking control of the Mississippi River, and we will see how they do that. Grant will take his troops down the land around the Mississippi, and then an admiral named Farragut will take his naval vessels up the Mississippi to an inland port called Vicksburg, which falls on July 4th, 1863. So once that cut happens, then chop can commence. And the chop commences when kind of the door to the South is kind of pried open after the Chattanooga campaign, taking the railheads at Chattanooga, with the Battle of Chickamauga before that, and that sort of thing. So once that door is opened, then William Tecumseh Sherman will take his troops down through Georgia and start what becomes known as total war. Now, there are historians that argue that total war happened prior to this time, and I would agree with that. But Sherman is a good example of this total war. So destroying the enemy's ability to make war in the first place. So that's chopping the Confederacy to pieces and taking away their ability to make war. So suffocate, liberate, cut, chop, decapitate. Decapitate means to take the capital. And by the time troops get here, the capital at Richmond, which is down the road quite a piece here, will be taken. And so that's the decapitate. The Union will try to do this twice, first with the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, and it's unsuccessful. And then when Grant is recalled to the east to run the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac in the east, then he will take Richmond. And this is part of Lee's retreat here at Appomattox Courthouse, where he will surrender. Don't tell anybody, but that's what's going to happen. And then there is this grind part, and that's really where we are now in the war, coming through the wormhole and plopping down here. Grant has this idea, and he kind of adds to the Anaconda Plan, where he will say, okay, it is time to fight as many engagements as we possibly can, as often as we can, because at this point in the war, late in the war, the number of Union troops outnumbers the number of Confederate troops almost 3-1. And so the odds are good that all of the Confederate soldiers will die before all of the Union soldiers die. And so that is just a crazy way to make war. In fact, it was nicknamed the Meat Grinder Campaign because of this. And in fact, the Women's Christian Commission and the Women's Sanitary Commission will start handing out little tags that look like luggage tags that soldiers would pin on the inside of their sack coats, so with their name and address, so that they could be sent home if they died, because so many soldiers were dying. It was just incredible. The Southern strategy, which will culminate here unsuccessfully, can be described with two words: gain and maintain. What they wanted to do was gain the support of a foreign country, especially England, because if they could gain the support of England, then they had a much better fighting chance to gain their independence from the United States. But that, as we will see, never happened. And really what the South had to prove in all this is they had to show that they could play offense as well as defense. And so they tried that in Maryland in 1862 at a place called Antietam Creek, or Sharpsburg, as they called it, which was the nearest town to Antietam Creek. And they were unsuccessful. That battle actually came to a draw at the end of the day, but Lee's troops retreated. And so it was seen as a Union victory. It was the bloodiest single day of fighting in the entire war. In fact, one soldier wrote that when he picked up his canteen back at camp that evening, he dumped out the water, which he had filled with creek water at Antietam Creek, and it came out red because of all the blood, all the bodies that were bleeding into that creek on that day. It's just amazing, just crazy stuff. So that was Antietam, and it was unsuccessful. And then the other big way that the South tried to get gain was through the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania in 1863, July 1, 2, and 3 of 1863. And that was also unsuccessful. And we'll talk about that in just a little while. But I wanted to give you the big picture of what was going on before we moved into the specifics. The last grand strategy of the South was maintain. And they wanted to maintain a couple of things. They wanted to maintain their border. So they were fighting mainly a defensive war, which gave them on paper kind of an advantage, because they were just fighting to keep the ground that they had. They weren't having to take more ground generally. And then they were trying to maintain this way of life, this hierarchical caste system of slavery that they didn't see a way out of in this time period. And so that's kind of the grand strategy. Now let's move into what was going on in the specifics of all of this. Now we're going to pick things up in 1861 in July. And you remember that things have kind of progressed since Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, that 4 more states had left the Union after the siege at Fort Sumter. There are also some skirmishes, battles over the western parts of Virginia, and that will later be secured and added to the Union in 1863. But really, the first big pitched battle, meaning soldiers lining up on both sides and shooting at one another, is the first Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861, and this was just a chaotic affair, because remember, Lincoln had called for 75,000 volunteers. Many more than that showed up, and they were bully for a fight. They wanted to fight, but they had different levels of training. They weren't used to being under a single command. The commander was a guy named McDowell that really was not up for the job, and it was a pretty impossible job anyway for the Union. There were picnickers that came along from Washington, D.C. to watch this battle in Virginia, because they thought it would be over and that the Rebs would just skedaddle, as they called it, back to their homes. And that's not what happened. What happened was that the Union put the run in Bull Run when they realized that these were real bullets and people were really dying. They hightailed it back to Washington, D.C. So it was a Confederate victory, and part and parcel to that victory was a guy named Thomas Jackson, whose troops stood their ground. And this became very legendary as they stood like a stone wall. And that's where Stonewall Jackson got his nickname in July of 1861. The overall Confederate commander was P.G.T. Beauregard, who you might remember was the one that gave the order for the siege at the port at Charleston at Fort Sumter. So Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard was his name. This is kind of before Lee takes command in all this. So that was that. And really the outcome of all of this was that it was kind of a bad win for the South and a good loss for the North, because the North saw, oh my goodness, we need to take this seriously. And so they started to train better after this. And the South kind of got cocky after this. And that came back to bite them a little bit. And so that's the first Bull Run. And that was the first big pitched battle of the Civil War. Next up, you remember that the North started to train, and they were trained by a guy named George McClellan. Now, George McClellan had been involved with some of the early battles over the taking of West Virginia, and had kind of proved himself there. And so Lincoln put him in charge of training the troops, and he loved to train troops. In fact, he, in his earlier days, did some translation of manuals, a bayonet manual, and he was just really into that. And he'd love to see his troops just perform perfectly on the drill field. And he did not want them to get sullied by going into battle. And so month after month after month goes on, and Lincoln is like, we need to go on campaign. We need to go and try to do the decapitate, right? Take Richmond. And McClellan drags his feet. Lincoln is getting frustrated. At one point, he will walk over to McClellan's house in Washington, D.C. He is received into the parlor by a servant, and McClellan will refuse to come downstairs to see him, and the President of the United States will wait for an hour in McClellan's parlor, and they never talk. It was a very contentious relationship that they had. And so what happens is, and then, Lincoln with his wit will at one point write McClellan a note and say, if you aren't using the Army of the Potomac, may I borrow them and take them on campaign, right? And with that kind of jabbing wit, you can see some frustration behind that. Well, McClellan will finally take his troops in 1862 up the peninsula, up the James and York rivers toward Richmond, but he moves so slowly and he moves so cautiously that the Confederacy has the opportunity to counter his every move and trick him into thinking that there were many, many more troops than the Confederates actually had. And so what happens, long story short, is that the Union Army will get about 20 miles outside of Richmond and then be turned back. And so this was the failed attempt at decapitate. Meanwhile, the Confederates were also trying to break the anaconda of the blockade, the Union blockade. And what they did was they put metal cladding around a ship, and this started a new era in sea warfare called the ironclads. And what eventually happened is that the Union made one of these as well, and there was this epic battle that was really pretty unmomentous, where these two ships, the Merrimack and the Monitor, will lob cannonballs at one another for about an hour, and they would just bounce off the other ship. But it really did usher in a new era in ships during this time period. Another thing about the Confederate ships and shipping is that there were blockade runners. There were these smugglers that had these steamships that were very low to the ground. They were low to the sea level, and they were painted gray, so they were difficult to see, and they would slip through the blockade. And so there were blockade runners. And then something I think that is very fascinating is that although there was not a Confederate Navy, there were Confederate warships that would sink U.S. supply ships, not in the United States, but in England, in the waters of England. And this wreaked havoc on U.S. trade. And there was one in particular, the CSS Alabama, I believe it was. I'd have to check my database on that. That was very difficult to find and very elusive. And it took a long time for the Union to find it and finally sink it. But that was a little bit about sea warfare. And that'll take us to the fall of 1862. Lee has replaced PGT Beauregard as the commander. McClellan has been fired and then rehired as the Union commander. And the two armies will meet in Maryland at Antietam Creek near a little town called Sharpsburg in September of 1862, September 17th of 1862. And this, as I mentioned before, is that single bloodiest day of fighting in the Civil War. And it is just horrific. And Lee will retreat. And what I didn't say before was that Lincoln wanted to end the war right then. And so he ordered McClellan to follow after the Confederate troops that were retreating and to engage them again. And McClellan refused. He said, I've seen enough bloodshed already. And Lincoln actually got in, went down to Antietam Creek and had words with McClellan, and McClellan still refused to do this, and he was fired for the last time. So there was really bad blood between these two men. And in fact, as we will see, McClellan will run for president against Lincoln in 1864, partially as a result of the bad blood that happens at Antietam. But the good news to come out of Antietam is that it gave the Union enough of an initiative that Lincoln drafts his Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is really interesting because what it does is it frees the slaves in the rebellious states. Let me say that again. It frees the slaves in the rebellious states. It does not free the slaves in the 4.5 states that will remain with the Union during the Civil War. These are the so-called border states, Missouri, Kentucky, western part of Virginia, that's the half, Maryland, and Delaware. And most of these states, except for the western parts of Virginia, did try to secede, but Lincoln did not allow that. And I talked about that earlier when I was down here before at Petersburg. So this was not only a social revolution of freeing the slaves, or some of them, but it was a battle strategy to undermine the economic understructure of the South, the labor understructure of the South. And it was set to go into effect on January 1st, 1863, which it did. During this same time period, as part of the Emancipation Proclamation, there were African Americans that were allowed to fight, and this was a big deal for the Union. There was lots of discrimination, discrimination in pay, discrimination in the types of jobs that these soldiers got to do, and that sort of thing. But it was a step forward in allowing African Americans, both free and former slaves, to help in their own emancipation. And they fought valiantly, and even under crazy conditions, because the South had said that they would not give quarter to any of these troops, meaning that they wouldn't take them prisoner, they would shoot them on sight. So this was a really risky move for the 186,000 or so African Americans, both free blacks and former slaves, that fought for the Union in the Civil War. And so that we'll get back to kind of some of the other results of the Emancipation Proclamation later on, but that was that. Now let's move on to 1863 and the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, what was happening by this time, there was yet another Union commander, and I haven't listed all the Union commanders. That would just bore you. It would just be a list of names. But by this time, a guy named Meade, M-E-A-D-E, is the Union commander, and Lee is still the commander of the Confederate forces. What has happened is that Lee, coming up to Gettysburg, has been in a string of very decisive victories, but with a cost. And that cost was what he called his right arm. Stonewall Jackson was accidentally killed by a picket, by one of his own troops. And so this really hindered Lee. Also, his cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, had kind of gone off to look for some supplies and had kind of gone missing. And that was a big deal for Lee because the cavalry acted as the eyes of the army. They would go ahead of the main infantry column, the folks that walked, and the artillery, that's the cannons, and they would set the form of the battles and that sort of thing, set the ground and get the good ground, the high ground, and that sort of thing. And so Lee was without those eyes as well. Um, and so he is up in Pennsylvania trying to get the support of Great Britain, right? Remember that part, the gain part. And the Union cavalry commander, a guy named Buford, will see what's happening, and he will work to take the high ground. And that's what happens there. And so so the Union gets a good position while the infantry is coming onto line. Um, and so Lee is forced to fight a defensive battle at Gettysburg. And so that first day is basically some skirmishing around taking that high ground. And the high ground was around the town of Gettysburg, and it looked like an upside down fishhook from north to south. And that was the high ground. Then we get to day 2 of Gettysburg, and Lee tries to break that fishhook by going around it at the bottom, at the southern end, at a place called Little Round Top. That is defended by William Chamberlain and the 20th Maine, and they have a really crucial role in all this, right? Because the Confederates are trying to go around and break up that line. And so if the line crumbles there, that could mean a very different outcome for Gettysburg. But what happens is that this will stay, and the line will stay. There's a very famous infantry bayonet charge that will rout the Confederates, and that saves that day for the Union. The third day, what will happen is that Lee will look for the weakest part of that fishhook, and he will see that it's kind of in the middle, but there's a huge field, open field between a line of trees where his men can take cover, and going up to an artillery position where all the cannons are in this time period. And so what has happened is that there will be a charge ordered, and this is a long charge. This area of land is almost a mile long, and it was called Pickett's Charge, and it was just devastating because more cannon were brought in, more artillery was brought in. They were shooting double shots of like what looked like big marbles at these troops, and just mowing them down. And it was just a slaughter. And that's why partially why Gettysburg is considered the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, over 3 days. And so that was the big turning point. After that loss for Lee, the Confederacy will never really stand a chance of winning this war again. And then they will be on the run, coming down toward Appomattox Courthouse that you see behind me. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, there is also kind of a second war going on in the West, in what was called the Western Theater. And this was in and around, at first, the Mississippi River. And this is where we begin to see Grant. Grant will take his troops down the Mississippi at places like Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, also at Shiloh, and he wins battle after battle after battle. In fact, at one point, Lincoln will say, "Who is this guy? He's winning battles," when none of his other generals are winning battles. And they say, "Oh, but Mr. President, you see, Grant is a drunkard. He is taken to strong drink." And Lincoln is reported to have said, "Well, find out what he's drinking and send a case to my other generals so they'll fight too." So he worked his way down to Vicksburg. Farragut, as I mentioned before, worked his way up to Vicksburg. They surround this inland port city at Vicksburg along the Mississippi. They will bombard it for a month and basically starve it out. And then the city will surrender on July 4th, 1863. So the Union has a really good week in 1863 in July, right? They win Gettysburg on the 3rd, and they take Vicksburg on the 4th, right? So this is really a good combination for Lincoln. What happens shortly after that is that there is the Chattanooga campaign that I mentioned earlier that opens the door for Sherman to head down south through Georgia, just destroying everything in his path. In fact, he will be quoted as saying, "I intend to make Georgia howl." He also said, "War is cruelty. There's no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over," right? So he was just in it to win it. He will take Atlanta, which was a major railroad depot around the time of the election, which really helped Lincoln secure re-election in 1864. And then by early, a little bit before Christmas in 1864, he will reach Savannah, and he will write a note to Lincoln where he says, "I present the city of Savannah to you as a Christmas present." And there is an interesting thing that happens here, and I think a very significant thing that happens once Sherman reaches the sea. This is called the March to the Sea, this campaign. As they go, they read the Emancipation Proclamation. And so by the time they get down to Savannah, Georgia on the coast, there are thousands, tens of thousands of newly freed men and women, former slaves, that are wondering, what do we do now? And so what happens is that Sherman will host a meeting that is very significant, and he will ask African American leaders, as well as the Secretary of War Stanton comes down to attend that meeting. There are about 30 people in that meeting, and he says, "What does freedom mean? What does all this mean?" And I think it's significant because this is one of the few times that there is input from African Americans about their future in politics, and this is huge. Out of that comes Special Field Order 15, and that will grant 40 acres of land to each freed family in the Sea Islands around Savannah, Georgia. And it will also provide them, if they want one, a mule. So this is where the term 40 acres and a mule came from. And that, although the war isn't over yet, that's kind of a hopeful beginning to Reconstruction. Now, as we will see, I don't want to give much away, but as we will see, it does not go well after that, but it's a hopeful beginning. Meanwhile, in 1864, it is an election year. Just because there's a war doesn't mean that there isn't some fighting, political fighting in the United States, in the Union. And as I mentioned before, McClellan will run against Lincoln. Lincoln will really want to win because he doesn't want McClellan and what were called the Peace Democrats to win the election. And so what he does is he does all sorts of things to try and kind of put the odds in his favor. The first thing that he will do is he will jettison his first vice president, and he will go with a guy named Andrew Johnson. Now, on paper, this looks like a good idea, but in reality, it was a horrible idea, as we will see. But Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. He's from Tennessee. But he is not a secessionist. He is the occupation governor of Tennessee during this time period. The border states, remember the importance of the border states. And so Lincoln thinks that he can pull support from the border states by having a vice presidential candidate, running mate that is from the border states. Now, as we will see, Johnson has all sorts of problems after Lincoln's assassination, not least of which is his just racist attitudes and his lack of education. He had about 6 weeks of formal education in his life. His wife taught him to read, for example. He will be the first president to be impeached in 1868, but I get ahead of my story. Long story short, the election of 1864 has Abraham Lincoln winning by a landslide. He does not win in Kentucky, even though there is supervised voting and that sort of thing, voting at bayonet tip. But he will win most other states. It looks like New Jersey might not vote for him, but the significant one is Kentucky that will vote for McClellan and the Peace Democrats. This is not, the other thing to know about this is that this is one of those strange elections where the two political parties merge together. There are the war Democrats, the ones that want to continue the war under Lincoln, and the Republicans, and they will come together to form the Union Party against the Peace Democrats. So those are the two major parties. All right. Then we get back to the fighting, and this is where we see, as we pick up the action, we see Grant putting into effect his meat grinder campaign that I mentioned earlier, where he will come down south, he will try to take Richmond, which he does, and then at this point where I am, at Appomattox Courthouse, just a little out of the way place where an itinerant judge will come through and try the cases every once in a while. It's not even a town, really. It's just a place where the court is held. That is kind of where Lee is retreating to, and they don't know it yet, but Lee is going to surrender in the front parlor of this McLean house behind me in April of 1865. Now, just after that happened, in fact, less than a week after that happened, Lincoln will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, an actor, a Southern actor who doesn't want the war to end and thinks that assassinating the president will help things. It doesn't help things. In fact, it throws the whole country into even more chaos at the hands of Andrew Johnson. But that will take us to Reconstruction, and hopefully I'll be back on the Enterprise by that time, and we will take care of this Romulan problem. Let me just check in with people and see what's happening there. So hold on just a minute. Okay. Yeah, so I'll need to leave now and beam up, and I think there's some more information about the Romulans, but we will see you back aboard the Enterprise next time. That's a little bit about the battles of the Civil War. Take care, everybody.